Welcome back, everyone. It is 2:15, a short break, and we are ready, I hope, for our next discussion here with Carissa Merrill. And Carissa is another University of Minnesota graduate with a background in arts and architecture. She formerly worked at US Bank as a senior accessibility consultant and then as a voice UX architect. And she's currently an independent consultant on conversational user experience. Her clients have included Edward Jones, Medtronic, and Venture Academy. So please welcome Carissa here to talk about building systems of inclusion. And I love this title, We All Do Better When We All Do Better. Carissa, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Andy, I think I need you to stop screen sharing so I can share. Oh, there we go.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to do that.
No, I'm totally all good.
I've got a lot of buttons to press and things to go through, but now it's all yours.
You're doing such a beautiful job. Absolutely no shade. All right, here we go. Wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much for the fabulous introduction, and still fangirling so hard over like all of the fabulous talks today, and just like so many times being like, yes, 1,000 times yes. So really beautiful thoughts being shared. So much, yeah, as Margaret mentioned earlier, notes to take. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us here and for just participating. I will say it's been like so fabulously inspiring and empowering and just like giving so much juice that I know that all of this like isolation from the pandemic has, you know, robbed us of. There's me taking you a selfie today because I've changed how I look a million times during this pandemic. All right, so here we are. So as Andy said, we're going to be going over how we all do better when we all do better. Just to set the tone for the agenda, we're going to kind of baseline some terms so that we know what we're all talking about when I say accessibility versus inclusive design, and how we're going to be talking about systems quite a bit more abstract and kind of a little bit both like aspirational and offering a little bit of kind of insight. We are going to be kind of like integrating the designing with trust, ethics, and integrity kind of more like into the systems approach. So I did not update my agenda to include that, so forgive that. But we will be talking about more systems as ecosystems, so kind of society, business, team, and individual, but really focusing on like how businesses, teams, and individuals are responsible for kind of that inclusive system. And yeah, before we wanted to get started, I just wanted to say thank you again. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all of the fabulous teammates who have educated me and mentored me and shared so much fabulous insight just today and otherwise. So grateful. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and I think that's something to be really mindful of, and I continue to be grateful. So I don't know why I always laugh when I say this, because it's just so true and it's like so present, but it's like, it's a kind of an interesting statement. Just, we all do better when we all do better. So this is by the inimitable Paul Wellstone. And this is really just a fundamental truth of my practice. Like I really believe this, and how we all have a responsibility, not only to ourselves and making sure that we're advocating for ourselves, but we're advocating for and including those around us. Nobody owns the table to give seats at the table. So it's really just like our responsibility to do the best by each other that we can, in every effort that we can. And especially in UX, I know that we're all in it because like we care about people and we care about like representation, and we know how important and impactful that is and what those design decisions mean. So I think it's just really important to be mindful of that, and really like as we aspire to do better. All right, so again, baselining some terms. What is accessibility? So essentially we're working with the social model of accessibility, saying that barriers are created between a mismatch of people and their environment. The disability doesn't lie on the person. It's not a medical model where there's something wrong with the person. It's that there's a mismatch. So for instance, if someone wants to go into a building, they can go in there a variety of ways. It does not have to be the stairs. It can be a ramp. It can be an elevator. It can be a variety of other things. So just knowing that like, we want to simplify like what is like the problem and know that there are multiple ways to solve said problem. And so again, yeah, like that bias and that that knowledge is kind of created rather than inherent. What are we talking about with successful accessibility. So it essentially just saying that it can be proven. So like when we, it allows for ease of access for people with disabilities. So essentially that there is a success metric, like something can be accessible because it can be usable. And so when we think about that, like, I think it's something that we talked about we didn't talk about it, but some of the former conversations I've been talking about is just being really mindful of like how we're measuring success. So in this instance, I just want to be clear, like, accessibility is measured with web content accessibility guidelines. There are different levels. So 2.1 is the current standard. They're working on 3.0. Level A is kind of like the bare minimum. What does that mean? It's kind of like no keyboard traps, text alternatives, captions, things of that nature. Double A is what most businesses ascribe to. And so that's like the level that most are held to the standard of. So there we have improved contrast, 4.1, 4.5 to 1. All text is provided. We have consistent navigation, things of that nature. Again, all of these things that benefit everyone, but are used with these metrics of success. AAA is kind of like the optimal, like the end all be all. We have increased contrast 7 to 1. Timing is an essential. We also have things that are more robust, such as like sign language interpretation, things of that nature. Again, just speaking to, I forget who mentioned it in the earlier conversation, but just like, I think Abby just about, again, catering to people that are your audience. For instance, like if you're a website that caters more towards people with disabilities or different types of abilities, then this would be a level that you would want to, or healthcare, if you're working with elderly people who have less technical acuity, the level AAA would be the one that you would want to shoot for. So again, just kind of like a very high level of what that means. All right, I just want to call out, I know this has been like a big topic of conversation for LinkedIn, and I just could not resist just having a moment. As we talk about how things are built in processes, in everyday activities, just like Matthias was saying, like as you brush your teeth, what it is not, what accessibility and inclusion is not, is like an add-on at the end. We're showing an image here of the accessibility overlay tool that a lot of companies are adopting as a way to kind of just like make things accessible at the end. It just doesn't work like that. It doesn't impact your compliance. It doesn't really solve the problems that you think it does. It creates separate experiences. So again, like the whole point of compliance is to have things one-to-one, and it's really just like a Band-Aid for a larger issue. So again, just want to be really clear that like what we're talking about today, like accessibility and inclusive design, is ongoing processes from ideation through development and beyond, and very highly iterative, very well informed by the people that you're designing for, not with. All right, what is inclusive design? Inclusive design, we're talking about basically the process-based methodology. So here we're talking about targeting on the mismatch of human characteristics and interfaces. So again, anything that makes people people. So we're thinking like race, religion, gender, language, cultural differences, technical acuity, age, all of these things that are, our distinguishing characteristics, and how we kind of can remove like those mismatches. So you can make something, accessible through inclusive design, whereas like something is proven to be accessible, but you're using inclusive design. So just want to be clear like how those kind of play with together. Again, yeah, got a little ahead of myself. Accessibility can and should be a result of an inclusive design practices. So that is something that is shared by both accessibility and inclusive design. Essentially, we're focused on removing those barriers. How do we get to do that? Knowing that it is an ever-moving target, and that, incremental changes still change, and it's an ongoing process for the everyday practice. All right, again, this was so many things from the previous conversation. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. This is attributed to a variety of different people, depending on like who you're looking at. But essentially, that was kind of like the impetus. I've talked about this kind of like loosely in some other talks that we give. I think we did one for UXPA earlier this summer, but essentially just saying that, when we're talking about accessibility and inclusive design and inclusive like businesses and practices, like all of these systems are getting the results that they're intended to get. The only way that we can change the results is to change the systems. So how do we do that? You build accessibility in from the ground up. You build inclusive design in. You like work on your hiring practice. You work on your retention models. Like all of these things are like whatever is happening as a reflection of this system is what it's intended to be done. And so we just need to keep working and fixing, if not redesigning them. All right. So something else that I think of when I think of system, I don't know if you all have seen this. It was Susan Simard was a professor, is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. But essentially, anytime I think of systems, I always think of trees magically, because she essentially did this study where forests are networks and they are a system unto themselves, and where essentially like there was historically like this thought process that trees were competitive, like they wanted all of like the sunshine, they wanted all of the nutrients, and so it was like a very competitive thing, like who's going to eke out one or the other. But that wasn't it at all. What they essentially found, or what she found, was that trees are a very connected, very symbiotic, like holistic system that helps and fosters and grows each other. And so we want to be like trees. We want to be like the forest. So one example of that was in one study, there was a Douglas fir that was injured by insects, and it essentially sent chemical warnings to a ponderosa pine growing nearby to say like, hey, get these enzymes into production. We have, there's an attack against us. And so that they could foster, kind of like a barrier before that. Another thing to know is that they protect each other. So that was kind of like the sending the enzymes, but they also like enrich each other. So there's kind of like a mother hub tree is what they call it, where essentially like it's kind of like the older trees in the community that are kind of like more strong or stronger and more resilient can send out nutrients to those like when there's critical time. So like if there's drought, if there's high heat, if there's different things that are challenging, obviously like not human-centered things, but more like environmental, so that they can share nutrients. They're also strengthened by diversity. So again, like it's not just like that, trees obviously and forests do not exist in a silo. So we're thinking of like that beautiful, fabulous mycelium that is like the network that resembles this neural networks of the brain and connects everything. It's wildly symbiotic, like the tree couldn't exist without the fungi couldn't exist without the tree. All of them are like really, really doing a lot better. So they have this beautiful symbiosis. And so again, this is essentially like kind of like the foundation of my talk is like, we want to be more like these trees, and we want to have like these systems where we're connecting with the community, we're protecting each other, we're enriching each other, and we're really like truly well strengthened by diversity. All right, so again, what I'm thinking how we're going to handle this is we're kind of going macro to micro. We have society, business, team, and individual. And again, these are kind of like ideas of systems and how they kind of like everything moves like organically, right? Like in and out. So the individual informs the team, which informs the business, which informs society, and vice versa. Society can put pressure on a business, which can change the team dynamic, which can, affect like how the individuals are like treated or brought up or hired into different companies. And so again, just being really clear that like this is kind of like an organic exchange, like up and down and sideways, and how all of that works. For the purposes of today, we're kind of going to be focusing on like business, team, and individual, just because like this can be like such a broad thing, and it is already like slightly more abstract. But perhaps there will be a future time when we can get a little bit more involved into like societal implications. I think so many of the talks today have done a really great job of talking about, societal implications of inclusive and ethical design, which I think has been really beautiful and energizing. All right, so when we're looking at social systems, we're thinking like, again, we're kind of using these principles from our forest friends. So how are we connecting with the community? Just really wanted to be cognizant that we're part of both a global and local economy, system, and society. I just want to be clear too, like I've been doing a lot of reading lately, like there's so much conversation going on about like how, the US's economy, but I think it's so important to kind of like reframe and be very mindful that like when we talk about it, it's people, right? Like we wouldn't have anything if we didn't have people. So being really clear that like while we participate in an economy, we are a society of people. And so when we think of social systems, and then again, like how we protect each other, like we're evolving and updating like these social norms. We've come so far from where we are now versus where we were 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, we still have like eons to go, but that's the beautiful thing about evolution. Like we're constantly learning, constantly growing, constantly changing, and having like that fluidity of like being open and vulnerable and honest to be able to adapt to like our environments and the people around us. Enriching each other's, again, like this is kind of going off like what I was just speaking of, you know, just providing learning opportunities, having accountability. I mean, I think there's so many things that have been evidenced about like how our social systems have changed things, both like as a reflection, again, from like that bottom up, like pushback to like outside, you know, forces of like even just outside of the US or like thinking about climate or different things, and having different kinds of accountability can really foster and engender change in a really big impactful way. Being strengthened by diversity, I think we can all see how like society and individuals, like we're so dependent on each other. Like that is our symbiosis, is, you know, we cannot have one without the other. And like all of these opportunities make us, you know, just a very, very rich fabric that is far more successful than if we were at it alone. All right, so jumping into, so that was just like very high level. Again, we're kind of going to be focusing on like business teams, individuals here today. So when we're thinking about business as a system, so again, when we're kind of like keeping in mind community, so essentially just saying that like businesses must engage with social change and community needs. It has to be like this constant communication up and down, forward and back. Buy-in has to be from a leadership level. This is not something that can exist on like a nuclear level. Like you have to have change and fluidity and that transparency and vulnerability through every level of the business, from a business to a team to an individual. So it has to be two-way, constant communication and adaptation. When we think about things that are, you know, are successful at this, you know, if you think of like Ben and Jerry's or Patagonia or Nike, we'll look at some other examples that, or more recently, I think I just saw something in the news today about, you know, Facebook, where they had job markets listed specifically to specific demographics. So they were excluding like women from trucking jobs or things of that nature, you know. So again, like, how do we do this? How do we protect each other? How do we learn from those mistakes of others to really know that like, oh, like this is bad, you know, again, so much in terms of like data and AI, like it's moving so quickly, one would say too quickly. If you're, you know, for instance, Timnit Gebru, who, side note, Timnit Gebru, we'll talk about her later, but anyway, learning from the mistakes of others, enriching. So again, like we really need to be committed to the enrichment of people, products, and services. So as we move forward, as we're creating this system, you know, so much has been impacted in the terms of that, like businesses are held accountable now in the way that they really have to have like, you know, like this positive impact and have this like responsive nature and to be enriching people's lives, because, you know, both like their staff and employees, as well as the people that they are communicating with and participating with, just because like they're, you know, people advocate with their money. I mean, they always have, but if anything, I would say that it's even far more impactful now in the global economy. And being inclusive, again, so we have the symbiotic relationship with employees, customers being strengthened by diversity, especially when we have, you know, like I'm consulting with Best Buy now, I was at US Bank, Medtronic, all of these companies. When you think of companies that have thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees in this global economy, like you really need to be attuned to what those impacts of, you know, like Abby was saying, of localization, how does that impact you, and be really responsive to, you know, not only the people that you're serving like outside of your company, but also internally to your company. Like, how are you fostering that environment of inclusion? All right. And when we're thinking about like, what are those benefits of inclusion? So we're kind of like thinking about how we like increase the market appeal. You know, read this really fabulous book that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's Building for Everyone, where it's Google's inclusive design like product team, where they did like really extensive research about like not only like is inclusive design valuable, but like what is also kind of like the business impact of that. And essentially just like hands down, both underrepresented and majority consumers prefer inclusive products. People feel better about it. Again, it works for people that when you have considerations, you know, like we have like accessibility and inclusive design, but we also have permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. So again, where it's kind of like really fostering that idea of like, when you design for one and extend for many, it pays dividends quite literally. And then additionally, like there's something to be said about like the, you know, the larger your market is, the the larger your market is. And it really does improve decision making. So when we're thinking about people like everywhere from like kind of like your C-suite down into your teams and as individuals, there's this really fabulous, I'm blanking on his name, Scott something. I'm blank. I'll look it up later and I'll be sure to share it out with you. I have a list of resources. But anyway, it was essentially just saying that like when we're talking about, like these business benefits that, hands down 10 out of 10 times that more diverse groups, even if they're not necessarily like top of their class, like because like the more diverse your group is, it will always beat out a group of homogenous, like very high achievers. So that comes to like, you check your own bias, you come up with more creative solutions, you have like more transparency, you see more value in like the individual like viewpoint as being part of like that team. It improves performances of teams and businesses. So for performance up to 30% of like those high diversity environments. And in terms of like actual like ROI, I don't know, I think this is not the correct statistic now that I'm looking at it, but every 10% improvement in diversity has a 0.8% return. I think it's much higher than that. So I'm going to double check that and correct. But anyway, and moving on and then to drive innovation. So essentially like when we shift this use case, context can create new solutions. And so essentially just saying that, again, the business benefits of like this system of inclusion continues to foster a beneficial environment. And again, like when we think about expanding our use case, this one is particularly for accessibility. So we're looking at a graphic here for essentially like the market share for considering like accessible product design. So when we think about, like globally, we have 700 million users coming in online in the next couple of years. There's over $1 trillion as a market for global consumers, and that was back in 2017. So you have to know that that's getting higher. When you think of the just the US LGBTQ IA plus market, again, from 2017, there was $917 billion. 1 billion people in the world have disability. So again, we can share this out, 18 trillion for the global women's income as of 2020. So just thinking about this, that like when we think about like increasing our market share, like it behooves us not only as like an ethical imperative, but it is also just like, it's good business. And so again, like we really just want to be mindful of like, as we're doing this, the spending power of different, like the Latinx users of, apps, or the $1.7 trillion of the UX community, or the 48% increase of the in mobile apps in the Latinx community. I think it's really important to be mindful of that. Sorry, I'm just trying to be inclusive and call out all of our graphics like as we go. All right, onward. And so I think that this really raises a really great question. I think we've all read the dozens and dozens and hundreds of thousands of articles about the Great Resignation. And I just see this as a really beautiful opportunity for the evolution of the system. This really is the evolution of work. Why are people leaving? Why are people making these changes aside from, like the obvious, like we have like a global pandemic that is increasingly weighing on like the mental health that is not over, is just, coming towards the end. But after a couple of years of being in this environment, what's really important to people? Like having flexible working hours, being able to have like that boost and feeling cared for. I think like that really speaks to people spend so much of their lives at work. Like it's really important to have like a system that supports you, that nurtures you, that grows you, and so that you can feel like you can be like your whole self there. Additionally too, I think we found 40% wanted flexibility in remote. Like this is so impactful not only for people with disabilities. We'll have like another statistic in a moment here where talking about that, but really just flexibility of care. Like not only if like you have children, but if you have pets or dogs or other multi-generational families that you care for, or what I mean, or you just have like like you particularly may have some neurodiversity, so you don't necessarily want to have like a 9 to 5 sitting at a desk, and you want to have some flexibility in like what that working style is. I think there's a really big opportunity of just like how we can evolve this to be more accommodating to everyone's diverse and unique needs, and still be measuring it by like their contribution and their value rather than the hours that they have like butts and seats, as I had had a previous employer call it. And then again, too, 26% left or found their new company because of a better company reputation. So again, people are making decisions not only with the money that they spend, but with the jobs that they take and the people they want to spend times around. So as we build these systems of inclusion, we really need to be mindful of that. It pays dividends in all different types of ways. Again, so when we're talking about the more opportunities for flexible work, for instance, like 40% of blind users have turned down a job due to transportation, which is just like wildly informative, just in the fact of like there are so many opportunities, I think, with like driverless cars and autonomy coming up with people with disabilities in the future. But like for right now, like that is like that's a really big issue, and we have a 47% increase anyway with productivity when we're working from home. So it's one of those things where it's like, I will say that the asterisk there is because that was a pre-COVID time. So just being really mindful of like, how are we defining success? I think that's something that we'll go over again and again with other examples as we look at them. But essentially, like when we're judging success, who's defining it? How are we defining it? Who is being excluded from that? Who is this being successful for? Who is gathering that data? So like, again, like how are we defining success for work? Is it really truly by the amount of hours and the amount of output, or is it going to be value-based? And so just being really mindful of like, what are our mental models? How are we shifting this? And what is the opportunity now for this to be more flexible, not only for people with disabilities and like diverse backgrounds, but for everyone, again, extending to many. So just thinking about some examples of inclusive design wins. The first example that we'll talk about is the Degree Deodorant, which has a super fabulous, it has a magnetic top and a wider base. So it was designed for and by, well, not for, sorry, I meant by a user who had some motor control issues. And so it was one of those things where like, not only was it really beneficial for them, but again, this is something that like when you extend to many, it has benefits for other groups beyond that. The Nike Fly Ease, this one is such an interesting use case because it's a very fabulous concept where it was the shoe that was released, I want to say last summer or the summer before, where essentially like you can hands-free, it has like a little hinge in the middle, so you can hands-free put it on. It was made and created for people with disabilities, but kind of like how, this is where you get into like the gray area of like doing good for doing well by doing good, or kind of like, anyway, it was very highly promoted, and essentially because it became kind of like this really like hot item for like majority consumers, it was really inaccessible for people that actually had disabilities and could benefit from it. And so just like being really mindful of like when you're making things for people, make sure that they can actually access those things and get them in a way that is easy and important. When we think about adaptive clothing, like there are so many examples of this. I was trying to pick just one and I couldn't. I mean, Target has their own line, Magna Ready, like they do all magnetic clothing for people, whether it's just like a sensory issue or a motor control issue or a variety of different things. I think there's some really great example of just like, it's so much easier to find clothing like this and find different types of accessories. And even IKEA, has visibles where they hack their own furniture with people with diverse abilities. So it's everything, from lamps to pillows to different types of furniture, and how you can, again, be more adaptive to the people that are using this. And so this is just kind of like how we think about like businesses executing on these like systems of inclusion. Where it doesn't necessarily work so well. So thinking about AI fails, again, this is kind of like getting into that conversation of like, how are we defining success? Because these things would not be out on the market unless we had like them defined as successful and being brought to market. So for instance, like the first driverless cars were initially not trained to recognize assistive technology, or I'm blanking on the not wheelchairs, shopping carts. So for like people that are houseless, or things of that nature. So essentially that like, so, and when I say assistive technology, like everything from like wheelchairs to canes to crutches or things of that nature, so like they wouldn't recognize people using assistive technologies as people. And so again, like have like their like ethics responsible, like how they would handle those. So just like, again, like who is being omitted, especially with people with disabilities or underrepresented communities. When you're using these large data sets and they're not represented in them, they are not going to be part of the solution. So again, that system was successful for like the data that went into it and how it was trained. The Gender Shades Project, super great, fascinating study about just essentially, again, when we're talking about facial recognition and what like that success looks like based on gender and tone of the face, gender and skin tone of the face, where like, you know, they say facial recognition is up where, you know, up in like 70, 80s percentile. But when you're looking at, you know, darker skin like women, it's from like 18 to 35, I want to say it's only like around like 22% accurate. So something like that. And then even, you know, and then it varies too, depending on platform, because like they all have like different training data. So for instance, you know, in that demographic, like Microsoft is like around 20%, IBM is like 34%. So again, like who is determining the success? Who is putting in like this data in input models, and how are we comparing it? Another example that I always think of when we're thinking of this, particularly with women, is we think about like the gender wage gap, and it's often quoted as like, oh, it's 72 cents on the dollar for women, but that's white women, that's English speaking white women, you know, like educated women. So, but like when you think of like other more underrepresented demographics, like Latinx women, I want to say it's like 57 cents, you know, which is obviously lower. And so like, how are we judging, like how are we establishing like that metric, and what are we using that in terms of like validation of like success and how we're presenting things? Amazon's training model, this one is a really big one. I mean, especially so much as we talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Just essentially like there's so often like thought that like, oh, we can use AI to remove bias. Like that's simply not true. Like that bias is, you know, like those algorithms are just as informed on biases by the people that make them. In this instance, Amazon's training model was trained by primarily men that they had in their company on primarily their resumes, and they were English speaking white men. So it was just like that was what was successful in like that model. So again, if you're not doing these audits to see who's being omitted, why they're being omitted, and how it works, and know how to understand that, then it's not truly successful. Voice technology, again, like this is something that I've worked closely with for a few years now, and just like really understand, like, you know, like as we think about things, especially in different platforms, you know, for instance, voice technology can reinforce gender stereotypes, whereas like, you know, feminine voices are historically seen as, especially in the US, as, you know, more like helpful, versus, you know, masculine voices are more like authoritative. And then also just like the personas that go into that, as well as like the voice selection. Some people do it better than others. I think Alexa is the only one that kind of has like the default feminine voice, whereas, you know, Google has a variety, and you are randomly ascribed to one of them, and then they reinforce like their choices by color selection, rather than kind of like mask or femme or name or things of that nature. All right, so moving into like the next stratus. So when we think about teams as system, how can we kind of like foster like that inclusivity, and how can we kind of like work on like being that beautiful like tree like network as a team? How are we connecting with community? So again, just being really mindful that this should be kind of like an up down kind of motion. Changes in teams can drive these changes within companies as well as societies. How do teams protect each other? Like there's been so much great conversation around this today, just in terms of like, how are you having like safe, inclusive, transparent environments, which again, like empower people to not only be more like satisfied at work, but to feel like seen and heard, but also like they're doing, you know, like they're 4.6 times more likely to like output like their best work. So it's like, it's one of these things that, again, it's a symbiotic relationship. Like we all do better when we all do better, enriching each other. How do we inspire, coach, promote? So again, this was so many of these points that I'm so glad that the panel earlier was talking about this, because I would love to go into it in more detail, but not with this particular moment. But again, essentially just saying like, it's completely one thing to get people in the door, and then what? Then you're absolutely responsible for fostering their career. I've been fortunate enough to have a manager at the place I'm consulting right now, where like, you know, they take that very seriously and are like, you know, I'm responsible for your career. Like it's, you know, up to us to, you know, kind of like empower and educate and inspire and work with like mentorship opportunities. And like, that is what those systems need, and as they should be. So those diverse teams have 26% more collaboration and 18% more commitment to the team when you feel like seen and heard and a part of something, and that your individual contribution enriches those people around you, and like you as a team are a solid cohesive unit. Maybe not like in the singular sense, but you know. And then again, being strengthened by diversity. So again, like diverse teams, like they're more likely to check their bias, they have improved decision making, they drive innovation. So all of these things are like value adds, as you know, like that symbiotic nature of inclusion. So how do we do this? I mean, so many of these things, I know that this is kind of like, we don't have time to get into like all of the nitty gritty of all of the things, but when we think about team processes, and as we've been talking about like how all of this must be done, you know, on the daily, what does that mean? It basically just means that inclusive design is everyone's responsibility. It is a daily practice. The same way with accessibility, like we're not adding on an overlay at the end of this. This is something that like we really need to work on like every single day. We need to show up and be present and have like these conversations. And again, everything from team hiring to the composition of the teams to testing with people, not, you know, making assumptions. I think like it's so true. Like we can have hypotheses around things, but really allowing for clear channels of feedback and communication. I do want to call out like something that I think is really important too. I think so often I've worked at places that like part of like that team and that commitment to belonging, so often like ERGs are used to do that. And I want to be clear that like ERGs are not there to be leveraged for testing and used as like cheap labor for business cases, because one, like they're more homogenous in the terms of like where they work and like what those exposures are in terms of like demographics, but two, you can't have you need to have a community for the sake of having a community, not for the sake of leveraging it for your business purposes with people aren't being compensated. So just being really mindful of like, if that is something that you want to do, perhaps considering like, you know, like the leadership qualities of like those ERGs or people that volunteer or participate, like that is something that is compensated for, not just something that is like taken as an assumption. So I think like that's really important. And again, just going back to how are we defining success as we go through the hiring processes, as we're going through, you know, like the ideation phases and kickoff. Are we simplifying our problems to be more inclusive? Are we knowing who is being excluded, and are we good with that? And if not, how can we augment that? If not now, but in the future, like how are we documenting and recording these changes? How are we sharing them out and socializing them with other teams so that we can all get better about this? And again, like consider like how are we using like these metrics of success? And again, like these are very, again, I would point to, you know, different places do it at different levels of success, but I will say that there's some really great building blocks in the Building for Everyone, like the Google's books of just like how we can kind of quantify and qualify it, just so that so that inclusion is truly like a business priority, and so that we can actually like be able to track it. Again, being mindful of how we're defining that. And again, just a reminder that we're designing with people, not for people. And so just being really mindful of like keeping that in mindset in our team processes. Again, so like when we're kind of thinking about this from like a team level, here's just some kind of like questions that we can kind of use to see if we're like fostering that in the way that we hoped. Again, who is being included in the scoping and then the testing? Who is left out? What problems are we solving? So I think there's like a really prescient example of this, of kind of just like, oh, like, if we're creating like a dry cleaning service, right? And you're just talking about your friends who are like dry cleaning, you know, need dry cleaning, but they're all, again, like they are your friends. And so you have like the same background, the same needs, the same abilities, the same, you know, income levels and things of that nature. Like that is a very homogenous look at something. Are we thinking about it as like, how are we like dry cleaning like these custom suits or what have you? Or are we thinking like the problem is how do we solve clothes? How do we do that in a more inclusive way? How are those problems different for people of different backgrounds? You know, whether it's like someone who doesn't necessarily have transportation or reliable transportation to get to and from, someone who doesn't have access to just like regular laundry and not even necessarily dry cleaning, someone who can't afford different things. So again, like just thinking about like different backgrounds and how like we can use that to kind of like not only gut check, but to prove out like, are we really solving and defining the problem in the correct way? Because really we should be thinking about like who else could benefit from this if we really like push the boundaries, like, you know, where else could we gain traction and momentum with whatever we're trying to solve for. And then two, just being really mindful of that, like we're not designing and making things in a vacuum. So what is the impact of this? Like if, you know, blue sky, everything comes to fruition and we like put this out in the world, what are those impacts? Like everything has a ripple effect. Again, as we think about like how our team, how our product, how our, you know, impacts not only like the business, but like society, like what is going to be the impact of that on a, you know, on a local level, on a regional level, on a global level, you know, how are these things being considered? All right. Sorry, I feel like I'm speaking really quickly, so forgive me. We're kind of getting down into it. So now we're thinking about the individual as a system. So again, when we're kind of looking at our beautiful tree inspired structure here, when we think about community, how are we building and fostering that community for ourselves beyond our immediate team? So again, this is perhaps participating in an ERG, offering support to like those around you, having like communications and relationships with people like outside of like your immediate team, and perhaps outside of, you know, like your traditional work in terms of like, you know, like this community group, for instance. How are we protecting each other? I think it's so important to be mindful, again, like we don't own the table. Nobody owns the table. We need to advocate and champion for those around us and really like build like that level of solidarity, just as, you know, being seen and heard and valued makes us feel better and do better. The same thing for other people. So how are we doing that? Like not only for ourselves and that self-advocacy, but how are we also providing that support to those around us that may need it at different times? How are we enriching? So again, being of service to others, symbiotic mentorship opportunities. How are we engaging with and like leveling up our own skill sets? How are we sharing that out? How are we establishing like those connections in order to be, again, like really inclusive of just kind of like knowledge and sharing and growth and transparency, and again just like really making that a priority. And then how are we being included? So we're empowered again by like everyone's inherent value of uniqueness as part of a team, as part of a company fabric. And so just being really clear that like when we talk about this, and like so often like it's so challenging, you know, when we think about like the language that's used around this, because like it's talked about so much, but what does it really mean? And I don't know, for me, I often struggle with like the fact that like authenticity is talked about and like vulnerability and like all of these things, but like it really like what they are meaning and saying is quite true. And I think more than anything, you know, like that vulnerability and ability to be, you know, honest and transparent. And I think something that particularly as an individual that we can all strive for is just like the vulnerability and like of being wrong, and knowing that like we're going to make mistakes, not only with our design practices, but our relationships, but our work and our language, and really just like every part of us. You don't know what you don't know. And even once you know it, like we need to be aspirational and kind in the way that like we're learning, growing, and giving that grace to others. You know, just because, you know, if I can be honest and transparent and vulnerable about like what I've made mistakes about, that can open up the opportunity for others around me to be able to do that. And then we can all like learn and grow together. It's a little woo-woo, but you know, it's true. All right. And then so as an individual, what are some of these? So again, like what are some of the principles that we can use to kind of like work with this in terms of like accessibility and inclusive design practices within like our lovely little ecosystem of teams, businesses, and society. You know, like what are our individual principles that we should align on. The first one is kind of, and these are from the Another Lens project of Airbnbs. This is just something that I found like pretty recently, and I thought that it was, again, pretty prescient. Another one is Mismatch. Kat James talking about exclusion. Sorry, I'm continuing to quote people then and mispronounce or misremember their names, but I have the list at the end of the talk that we'll go through. So that's, I'm getting ahead of myself continually, so forgive me. Anyway, these were just kind of like 3 simple rules that I think are really good principles, again, to like put into like that daily brushing our teeth kind of action of accessibility and inclusive design. Balance your bias. Like, know where your limitations lie. Know that you are only your lived experience. And as much as we can hypothesize and as much as we can read and as much as we can try to know and grow and understand about other people's, all we have is our own. We have our own bias, and it is inherent. And so just be really cognizant of that. And that's why you know, again, working with like these fabulous, diverse, inclusive teams, that's the whole point, right? Consider the opposite. So again, like if you have something that's been really valuable to me, like as, you know, like working in accessibility and inclusive design, is just like being really mindful of like, how are we shifting that lens? Like, how are we like, okay, so this is for me in this like mental model and this mindset, and this is how I'm understanding, or like, you know, how do you kind of shift that? And then also just like, so like from either another perspective or a variety of different things. So just being really mindful of that. And then also embracing like a growth mindset. So again, kind of like what we were talking about before, but really just being cognizant of the fact that, you know, we're going to make mistakes. We have a lot to learn. We have a lot of improvements and growth to have. So just being really mindful of like that, our responsibility is to really engender that. And then the other thing too, I think just like, I'm always going to go back to it because accessibility, you know, is good design. So when we think about this, you know, from a UX perspective, I think it's really like, if we just really simplify and condense accessibility principles down to a couple things to be memorable, it's like POUR is the acronym that it's used. So again, perceivable. Can the user see, hear, or interact with the interface? And again, we're talking about one-to-one experiences here. So if we have like a voice user interface, like how can someone who is deaf and hard of hearing interact with that? If we have, you know, something that is visually represented, how do we make sure that something like that is, you know, either has off-screen content? How do, you know, so again, so is it perceivable? Is the first principle. Is it operable? Can a user interact with whatever modality that they might be at? So how are we meeting them where they are? Is it understandable? Again, this is like a lot speaking to like, can we understand it, learn it, and remember it? And again, are there also channels? I know, especially in like voice design, you know, like repeat that, go back, and like how those navigations happen. It's like, you know, like those should be like very conversational. Whereas like you don't have perhaps a visual interface to respond to. So just being really mindful of like, what does that mean for different people? And also, how do you have tools around that can positively reinforce? And then robust. So can a user interact with technology of their choice? Is there a variety of ways to understand their information? If you're looking at complex data, is a data visualization better? Is there a text equivalent? Different people have different learning and mental models, and also different, depending on how and when they're engaging, they may or may not have a screen. So just being really mindful of that. So again, POUR: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. All right, so here it is, as promised, people doing really great work that I find like wildly inspiring and very cool to keep up on. The Institute for Ethical AI and Machine Learning. I didn't have enough time to get into this today, but they have like a really fabulous, super robust like framework of, you know, essentially just like kind of like auditing, like there are principles for, you know, like from your data into like the inception and then the testing of AI, and like what does that mean? How can we be more ethical about it? How do you really understand, again, not only how it works, but how we're defining success? So that's super fabulous. The Algorithmic Justice League, they do so many fabulous things. That's a project. The Gender Shades project we talked about in terms of like, again, the discrepancy of success metrics. Coded Bias is a really fabulous documentary actually done by the Algorithmic Justice League. That's on I think it's still on Netflix. Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design. That's the book that I was speaking about. That's a really great one. That one talks about a little bit more of like a communities and systems. So like architecture as well as, kind of art and design. Building for Everyone, that is the Google Inclusive Design product design book. Inclusive Design for a Digital World. That one is mostly for like web and accessibility, but lots of really great information in terms of, like design heuristics for accessibility, how to kind of consider things, lots of really great case studies in terms of like validating like why accessibility and inclusive design is important. Timnit Gebru, so I didn't really get a ton of time to talk about them, but she's a super fabulous ethical AI researcher who actually used to be at Google. If you have a chance, please read about her. She's really fabulous, essentially the one that's basically saying that like AI is evolving too quickly for us to really be truly ethical about it. And basically like her questions and concerns, she was ousted last year from Google's ethical research team, coincidentally, by raising some questions about what was or was not acceptable. So just shows you how ethical that research team was. Anyway, and then of course there's always the hashtag A11Y on Twitter. So there's so many fabulous people out in the community that are ready and willing to help. So any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to put it out into the Twitter sphere and you'll get so much robust, lovely feedback. Yeah, and that's it. That's all I have for you today. So thank you so much. And I look forward to any questions or comments y'all might have.
Thank you so much, Carissa. And yeah, anybody have a question? Go ahead and add it. I see we have something came in from Q&A from Yuhan Wu saying, beautiful presentation. Accessibility is greatly studied in academia as well, e.g. the optimal level of environmental contrast for wayfinding. Can you share some details on whether such academic findings are leveraged in your work or the usability world in general, or is it more practical to conduct usability studies with actual products?
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to read that one more time just because.
Yeah, there's a lot of information there.
Yeah, sorry, that is the thing. So when we're talking about, oh, I see. So are we saying here, can I just get some clarification? So essentially, are we just saying that like when we're talking about accessibility, like is this actually like, do we have like case studies for usability? Is that what we're asking? Because if that's the case, or if it's more practical to conduct usability studies with actual products. I mean, I think that it has been proven. And I think that even, well, for instance, I can speak about the, so yeah, I think like not only is it like from an academic setting, but again, like if we're talking about inclusive testing from like a product standpoint, it's really important. And also like that feedback is like, again, like you design for one and extend to many. So like when we think about, for instance, even like the Smart Assistant at US Bank, like that was one of those things that like we really kind of like advocated for, like being like two different methods of input, essentially, where it's not like voice only, it's not voice as a channel, but voice as technology. And so just like the differentiation between that. And also like when we did that testing, there was so much validation, not only from the people that we tested, with disabilities, that would be like, like our primary defined like use case of like why we were validating, like including like a keyboard input, but in those cases where it's like, situationally, like people just may feel more comfortable. I think we often use like the situational context of like people being on a bus, but straight up, like it doesn't matter like what the context is. Like we need to meet people like where they are and how they are. And so when you're designing things that are inclusive and accessible, like that really works for people of a variety of different things. I think the other thing to be mindful of too is like when we think about like things being accessible and designed for people with accessibility concerns, it's like all of those numbers and all of those metrics are people that are self-reported. So for instance, like I might use something that was done and designed and built for accessibility, but that isn't, like I am not a self-identified person with a disability. So you know what I mean? Like it doesn't necessarily, like while it's designed with an intention, like again, like it creates impact and positive use cases for everyone. So it's again designed for one, extend to many. And then I think too, just want to be sure that I'm answering the question, and forgive me if I did not answer it, but I think that's what you're saying, but feel free to let me know if that is not. Oh, here. So for example, oh, so I see. I got you. Yeah. So essentially like, yes. So it's really great to have like hypotheses. So, and for instance, like something like color contrast is something that's a little bit more hard and fast. So for accessibility specifically with WCAG, like some things are very heavily defined. So for instance, like color contrast is like, there's 3:1 for like large text, 4.5:1 for smaller text, and for like level AAA, it's 7:1. And so there are things like that are like defined, and so that can like pass or fail. Versus like that's not so much like a gut check. Like some of the things that like maybe a little bit more looser to interpretation would be like if you think about things with cognitive consideration in terms of like comprehension and understanding. So some of the ways that we like validate those now is like by reading level. And again, like this is, it's not a perfect system. It's something that you should absolutely be testing like with your actual user base. So for instance, if like we're testing language or like validating like something is has comprehension to like a 5th or 8th grade reading level, and we're testing that, but perhaps like a large majority of like the demographic that we're serving has like English as a second language, and there are some things that are not translating as well, or like like they mean different things. So like again, like how are we, you really should always validate like with your actual customers and user base, and just being mindful too of like that we really want to be expansive of that. So we can hypothesize by like inclusivity, best practices, universal design, accessibility, like WCAG guidelines, but really we should be using those to kind of like validate ourselves.